Samuel Scheffler launches a bold and original investigation of what he calls the afterlife.
Finally, a book about me.
Actually, it's not about life after your own death.
Then what's it about?
Well, it's about the importance of other people living after you die.
Why should I care about that?
Well, let's see.
In his short book, Death and the Afterlife, Samuel Scheffler invites us to imagine two different scenarios in which the human race faces imminent but not immediate extinction. The first, which he calls the Doomsday scenario, invites you to imagine that you live out your natural span of life, but 30 days after you die, a giant asteroid hits the Earth and wipes out everyone on it. The second scenario, which he calls the Infertility scenario, is one that he draws from the novel The Children of Men by P.T. James, later adapted into a film by Alfonso Cuarón, in which the human race has become infertile, that nobody is dying unnatural deaths, but there are no new children to replace people as they slowly die off, and so the human race slowly inches toward extinction. Now, there are, I think, important differences between these two scenarios, and even within the scenarios, there's different ways they could play out. With the Doomsday scenario, is this something that you know and you alone, or does everybody know about it? But Scheffler's main thought here is that however these scenarios play out, in all of these cases, they don't affect the fact that you get to live out the full natural length of your life. The bad stuff that happens, the extinction of humankind, happens after you die. But, he suggests, nevertheless, you would probably be very upset at this news. Not only upset, but it would radically change the way that you live. And there are a number of different kinds of activities and projects that Scheffler thinks would be particularly vulnerable to these doomsday or infertility scenarios. The most obvious are goal-directed projects that have some kind of long-term payoff. Suppose you're working toward a cure for cancer. Now, you might happily work away at that, knowing full well that it's unlikely that within your lifetime we will find a cure, so long as you can contribute to finding that cure. But if you were to find out that the human race is going to go extinct 30 days after you die anyway, well, what's the point in curing cancer then? So projects like that would be particularly vulnerable to losing their salience in a doomsday or infertility scenario. There are other things like working to protect the environment, engaging in some kind of political movement that you hope will transform the world. But Scheffler thinks that it's not just these kind of long-term projects that are vulnerable. He also suggests various kinds of artistic or intellectual or academic activity might be vulnerable, that why compose my great symphony if nobody is going to hear it more than 30 days after my death? He also talks about the ways that involvement in various groups or traditions might be vulnerable. Why invest a lot of energy in making sure that my particular religion or my nation continues to thrive if all nations and all religions are going to be wiped out soon after my death? So for Scheffler, and this is also true of James and Cuarón in the way that they imagine the infertility scenario, it looks pretty bad. That it's not just these long-term projects that lose their salience, but in the fiction of The Children of Men, all sorts of shorter-term pleasures also lose their salience. People become kind of torpid. They lose their enthusiasm for life because they know that there isn't much life beyond them. And I think it's an interesting question whether these speculations are accurate, and also whether that's how we should greet the imminent extinction of humankind. So perhaps on a more optimistic note, there are certain short-term pleasures ranging from love and friendship to good food that might become more satisfying, more intense, because we know that we're enjoying the sweetness of these pleasures with the limited time that humanity has left. Or perhaps also artistic activity. While I might not be able to look forward to people centuries from now hearing my symphony, perhaps that will only focus my attention on the pleasure and the beauty of working on it in the here and now. So it's not obvious that all of human life will become sad and meaningless in a doomsday or infertility scenario, but it certainly seems like a large number of our projects would be rendered moot. And I think there is a really open and interesting and probing question, both how we would respond to this news, how it would change the way that we would live, and also how we should. What would be the best way of living in the face of this imminent destruction? Scheffler thinks that this thought experiment reveals a number of interesting features about the nature of value that often go unnoticed. This idea that humankind will continue to exist for an indefinite length of time after we die is what Scheffler calls the afterlife. So when he's talking about the afterlife, he's not talking about me surviving my death, but rather humanity surviving my death. And he says that this assumption that there will be a human race for long after I'm gone is a sort of a basic background assumption to a lot of what I do and a lot of what motivates me. And his goal with the Doomsday and Infertility scenarios is to focus our attention on the significance of the afterlife. He thinks we often overlook its significance precisely because we take it so much for granted. But that when we imagine, we hypothesize removing this afterlife, suddenly certain features of our values come into sharp relief. He gives three. So the first is that it shows that there's a non-experiential aspect to value. That you might think that all the things you value are things that you'll experience. But by hypothesis, the Doomsday scenario talks about a bunch of things happening after you die. And if the fact that these things are going to happen after you die radically transforms the way you live, that suggests that there are things that you care about that lie beyond the scope of your own lived experience. The second point that he draws out is that there's a non-consequentialist dimension to value. So consequentialism is an ethical view according to which the good or bad of any event or action lies in the goodness or the badness of its consequences. So a good consequentialist, when presented with the Doomsday scenario and asked how they would react, would say, wait a minute, let me think this through. Well, there are some pros, namely that there would be no more injustice, war, tyranny, crime, disease, and all the rest. There would also obviously be some cons, that people would no longer be able to love, they would no longer be able to live, they would no longer be able to enjoy all the goods of life. And so the consequentialist might want to sort of weigh up the pros and cons and then decide whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing that the human race faces imminent extinction. And Scheffler's point is not that the consequentialist would reach the wrong conclusion. You could imagine the consequentialist might say, well, on balance, the cons outweigh the pros, so I also am upset that the world is coming to an end. Scheffler's point is rather that we don't actually do this math. When we're presented with a possibility of the imminent extinction of the human race, we simply think, oh my gosh, that's terrible. We don't think, I think that's terrible, but let me do some math first. So his suggestion is that our immediate reaction suggests that there is something other than just the weighing of consequences that's at stake here. And the third feature that Scheffler draws out is what he calls the conservative dimension of value. The idea that valuing something means wanting to preserve or sustain it. So that one of the reasons I might lose my enthusiasm for getting involved in political activity or in artistic activity is that the things that I'm working on there, I'm hoping to preserve or sustain them beyond the span of my life. And if they're going to disappear anyway, I am distraught by that fact. Now, that conservative dimension of value for Scheffler helps to highlight the importance of traditions and groups to our sense of what matters. And we can understand traditions and groups quite broadly. We can think about nations and religions, or maybe the two obvious ones, but you can think about your membership within a profession. You can imagine certain forms of political activity. You can even imagine certain kinds of fandom or hobbies, that I might be a supporter of the Vancouver Canucks, or I might belong to the community of Dungeons and Dragons players, or whatever else. And the thought is that my membership in these various organizations and groups is, first of all, an expression of what I value and what I care about. That, this is maybe most obvious with religions and with political activity, that these are ways in which I give expression to my values and find a community within which I can further those values. And because I'm a member of these different groups, there's at least the hope that I'm participating in something that has a span longer than my own life. So, for example, if I'm a member of a religion, almost all religions are quite ancient, so I'm inheriting a tradition that has been going on long before my birth. And if I have a real commitment to that religion, I hope that that religion will continue to endure long after my death. I'm, you might say, in a stewardship role. I'm sustaining that religion. If everybody stopped being Christian for 50 years, Christianity would in effect die out. So those who are a Christian are in some way participating in the continuation of that tradition. And it's by belonging to these larger traditions and groups that we are connected to a longer past, and for Scheffler, importantly, a longer future. And that's one further way in which Scheffler thinks that this afterlife plays a really important role in our values. What's the point in sustaining and preserving and being a part of these groups if we don't have reason to hope that they might continue into the future. And what's more, Scheffler thinks that this allows us to personalize our relationship with the future. There's a sense that, okay, well, I might die, but as long as I can sustain my participation in the Christian religion or the nation of Canada or in my leftist political activities or whatever else, there will be people in the future who share my values. There's a sense in which I'm working toward creating a future in which, if I were, contrary to hypothesis, to live long after my death, I would feel at home in the world. There's a sense in working to preserve a world in which I feel I belong long after my death. One of the more intriguing conclusions that Scheffler thinks he can draw from his thought experiments about doomsday and infertility is something about the limits of human egoism. And you can see this if you go back to his example of the cancer researcher. So you have somebody who's working away, giving a huge amount of their life and energy to finding a cure for cancer. Now, if you give this person a crystal ball and tell them, we're not going to get a cure for cancer within your lifetime, that person might well shrug and say, well, yeah, that's too bad, but as long as I can contribute to working toward a cure, I will feel my life has been well spent. Whereas if you give that person a crystal ball and tell them, you're going to come very close to finding a cure for cancer within your lifetime, but then 30 days after you die, the world is going to end. That person will say, oh, well, forget it then. I don't really think it's much worth my while to try to cure cancer. And Scheffler doesn't think that's especially remarkable. Of course, you're going to lose your interest in curing cancer if people are going to die out before the cure is found. But he does think it's interesting that by contrast, people are willing to continue to work at projects that they won't see through to their completion. So there's a sense in which my finding it reasonable and worthwhile to work on a cure for cancer depends less on my own continued existence and more on the continued existence of other people who haven't been born yet, other people I haven't even met. And so Scheffler thinks that this shows that the coherence and meaningfulness of our projects depends very significantly on the existence of other people and other people we don't even know and don't even care about. And he suggests that if this is so, that would reveal a significant limit to a certain presupposition people often take about human egoism, that an egoist might think that the only thing that matters is what brings them personal satisfaction or personal pleasure. And Scheffler wants to say that if it's true, as he thinks it is, and argues, I think, fairly convincingly that it is, that lots of our projects would lose their salience, would lose their importance for us if we faced the imminent extinction of humankind. He thinks that that shows that people are less egoistic than we normally suppose, because they're clearly invested in things that lie beyond their own experience and their own lives. Now, I think it's an interesting question what kind of limit to egoism this presents. Is it that I care so much about these future untold generations that I would rather that I die than they die? Or is it rather that the activities I'm engaged in right now are sustained by my expectation that those future generations will live? Now, that doesn't have to be unegoistic. You know, I could be working away at becoming a world dictator whose statue will stand for 1,000 years, and it would be really important for me for humankind to exist so that they could honor and revere me for generations to come. That's not especially unegoistic, but it is a project that does depend on the continued existence of humankind. So just because I have a lot invested in the assumption that humans will continue to exist long after my death, that doesn't itself show that I'm not super duper self-centered or self-interested. But it maybe does show something about the way in which my projects depend on and are entangled with the future existence of humankind. And I think it's an open question to what extent and in what way that then shows that humans are maybe less egoistic than is sometimes supposed.
So if the world ends soon, then making all these YouTube videos was kind of a waste of time. But in the hopes that it doesn't, I would love it if you would give this video a like or maybe consider following this YouTube channel.
A legacy you can be proud of.